There were 4 men who'd wagered silver coins that the widow wouldn't last through her second winter. 4 men holding back outside the feed store in hats, pulled low and fingers tucked warm in coat sleeves, who chuckled each time she walked through town without a husband at her side. They all thought the same thing, even if none of them said it. A woman alone in the valley's sedge, let alone buried in a hill like some kind of mole, had no business lasting past the first freeze. They hadn't said it to her face. No one had, not really, but the laughter behind her back felt sharp enough to split wood. Her name was Elsie Vaughan, and though her hands were calloused, her shoulders narrow, and her eyes always tired, there was something behind them that never sagged with the weight of hardship. Not when the roof leaked her first spring dot, not when she gave birth in the dark, with nothing but a stump to bite on, not even when she buried her husband 3 weeks later, with 1 foot of snow still on the ground and the baby crying in her arms. She didn't cry that day. She didn't cry any day after, because crying wasted heat. And in a cabin like hers, half buried into a southern-facing ridge with a low green roof and round little door stacked from scavenged stone and salvaged timber, heat was everything. She'd built it not for appearances, but for survival. It was warmer, underground. That's what the old Civil War engineer passing through last spring had told her, the one who'd once built powder magazines under hillsides in Tennessee to keep munitions from freezing. Buried rooms held warmth longer. That knowledge stayed in her head like a seed waiting to sprout. And once her husband was gone, and the trees, too wet to burn through winter, and the baby always cold, she got to digging. At first it was just a root cellar, then a dugout, then stone walls laid flush against bare clay, then 1 beam, then 2. Then she remembered how he'd once sketched her own roof on paper, something that curved like a barrel over a trench. Notched pine logs braced into thielside, then wrapped in sod and moss and hay and mud, and on top of it grass. From a distance, it looked like nothing but a lump of earth with a chimney stub poking out, a round door cut into the front like something from a children's book. But what lived inside it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a mother, a widow, a baby girl with ash-dark eyes, and a fire that rarely died. The other cabins across the valley were always fighting over wood. Every morning men trudged through the snow to chop more. They hauled cords of it, built stack upon stack, kept it in sheds, dried it in Leontos, and still they ran low before spring. But not Elsie. She used half. At first, folks assumed it was just because she was alone. 1 person doesn't need as much fuel. But when February came and her baby hadn't taken sick, when she'dn't once come asking for spare logs or kindling scraps, someone got curious. It was Old Man Lot who first marched up there, one dusk with a bundle of wood tucked under his arm. Thinking he'd play the role of generous neighbor. While getting a look inside, she opened Theron's door slow, took the bundle without smiling, told him her daughter was sleeping, and to please not come again. But he'd caught a glimpse of the floor warm with flat stones, of a clay hearth set deep and smart against the wall, of hestage curtains pulled close against the half-circle window, of a ceiling no taller than 6 feet, domed tight like a stove pipe, of heat, cozy and dry, not stifling, not smoky. And he came back down shaking his head. She's living in a hobbit hole, he muttered at the tavern. Swear to God, whole damn house is inside his hill. The laughter came easy then. From the men, from the wives, even from the school teacher. Or maybe she'll start growing turnips in the walls, someone joked. Or smoke pipeweed with the gophers. But that first winter, her chimney never stopped smoking, and her daughter never caught cold. And she never once asked for help. It was in Theskand winter that everything changed. The snow came early that year, and hard. A single storm blanketed the ridge with through a feet of white in less than a night. Several roofs cracked. 1 family's porch caved. 1 man lost 3 toes. And by the 3rd week of December, firewood was running short. The logs that had seemed abundant in October were gone now. Wet, frozen, molded. Most hadn't dried right. And the creeks froze solid, which meant water had to be boiled from ice. Which meant more fires, which meant more wood, which meant even less to burn. And that's when folks started asking questions. How's that widow doing? Y'all think she's still up? There. I ain't seen smoke in a few days. Maybe the wind's wrong, but she was still there, and she was warm. They didn't know about the rocks. Not just any rocks. Big flat stones she'd Halidans stacked into the floor like a mosaic. But not for looks. for retention. Her old neighbor had once told her heat could stay trapped in stone, that it radiated slow. So she'd place them under the stove, let the heat sink in all day. Then, once the fire died, the stone stayed warm well into the morning. She didn't know why she'd made it work. She just knew it did. And it meant she only had to light one fire a day. At dawn, she'd bank it thick with hard pine and let it burn low. Then she'd cover the coals with ash, close the flue, and by nightfall, the rocks would still be warm under the baby's crib. She checked them with her palm, and when the outside wind howled and men down below cursed the trees for being too green or too split or too gone, she simply laid another blanket across the door, tucked her baby in a cradle, stuffed with wool, and let the hill do the rest. Word traveled, first a whisper, then a rumor, then a curiosity. Is it true she only burns one log a day? I heard a house is warmer than mine, and she's 20 feet under snow. Lot said she's got stones in her floor. Whole thing heats like a pie oven. Why don't we got one of those? Some men scoffed, but not all, and not the ones whose firewood waste already gone. One night, someone knocked on her door, a man named Bennett. 2 boys at his side, one coughing, the pale. They had no wood left, and he'd heard she might share some warmth. She opened the door, looked at their children, stepped aside. That night, they slept on the stone floor, wrapped in wool near the still warm hearth. Theaby never woke. The boys stopped coughing, and by morning, the frost on their lashes had melted. He didn't ask how she built it. He just said, "Thank you." But others weren't so quiet. When word got out that she'd let someone in, 3 more families came, not asking for handouts, just curious, polite, a little embarrassed, but desperate. She let them feel the warm rocks, let them sit inside for a few minutes, and realize just how much warmer a Dugan cabin could be. Then they left, and whispered what they saw to others, and that's when the tide began to turn. No one laughed anymore. By late January, 4 new cabins began taking shape on the south-facing ridge, not above. Into it, men who'd once smirked at her little round door were now cutting through frozen sod with pickaxes, trying to dig 4 feet deep into permafrost just to match what she'd built in spring. The widow didn't gloat. She didn't smile when they came by. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just offered advice when asked. Told them how to lace down flat, how to slope the chimney pipe, how to seal against draft with mud and ash and hay. And that was enough, because for the first time since her husband died, folks didn't see a fool anymore. They saw someone who knew something they didn't. Someone who'd figured out what their fathers hadn't. Someone who'd built for heat, not pride. And when the 3rd storm hit in February and 3 above-ground cabins caved from ice, no one dared laugh again. Not when smoke still rose from the widow's chimney. Not when her baby girl played barefoot near warm stones. Not when fiend outside shrieked and she still burned less wood than any man. By the time March winds rattled the valley's bare cottonwoods, there were more eyes turned toward the widow's buried cabin than ever before. No one was laughing at her. No one even dared to whisper behind her back. They were too busy trying to stay warm, too busy carrying water from the creek in the half-thaw and splitting what greenwood remained. Most nights the air inside regular log cabins felt colder than the wind that blew off the ridge. And though folks stuffed rags in the window cracks and nailed blankets over doorways, it never seemed to hold. Every family had at least one child who'd taken ill that winter. Some had lost livestock. One had lost a grandmother who simply didn't wake. And still the widow's cabin remained like a pocket of earth the blizzard couldn't reach. Tucked halfway into the hillside, her round front door never froze shut. Her chimney never stopped puffing low smoke. And her child, now walking, now full of teeth, now laughing with squeals that echoed faintly through snow, hadn't coughed once. What once looked foolish now looked like prophecy. Elsie Von Ever said she'd built something better. She never claimed she'd outsmarted the men, but she had. Without declaring a thing, she'd put every last one of them to shame. Because while their stoves devoured kindling like it was air, while their cabins fought drafts from every corner and seemed fold their wives boiled potatoes, wearing gloves inside, the widow was saving wood, sleeping warm and alone with a toddler in her arms. She had survived better than any other homesteader on that stretch of land. It wasn't just the heat or the stones or the sod-packed roof. It was how it all worked together. A harmony of heat and humility, of low ceilings and tight doors, of knowing that the sun always shit hardest on the south face of a hill, and a cabin set into that side would take its warmth, like bread rising near a... Most of the men had never thought about things that way, but the widow had, and that more than anything changed everything. It was Jacob Milan who came to her next. A large man, quiet, not one of the laughers, but not a friend either. He'd once passed her in town and said nothing when a group of boys kicked snow at her skirts, but Noel stood at the edge of her door. He didn't knock. He waited, and when she opened it, holding her daughter on one hip, he looked her in the eyes. "I got 6 mouths," he said, not proud, not begging, "and 2 of her ain't old enough to feed themselves. I heard you built something smart, smarter than we did. I got the hands to dig, but not the know-how. Could you come look just once?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at his eyes, his hands, the calluses, the way he held his hat, like a boy in church. Then she nodded. "I'll come tomorrow." That was how it began. Not a flood, not a movement, just one trip, one pair of boots crunching across frozen snow to another family's plot. One woman pointing where to dig, how deep, where the earth held moisture, where it let heat escape. One woman explaining how rocks hold warmth longer than dirt, how you could build a stove low, set it flush with stone, so no heat climbed where it couldn't be used. And then she went home. The next day, another knock. A young couple. Their baby had been coughing blood. They hadn't asked to come in. They asked to copy her design. She nodded again, but this time she gave them more sketches on scraps of paper, arches and walls, and placements of vents. They stared at it like scripture. Word spread. She didn't go down to town. She didn't need to. They came to her. Not just men, wives, teenagers, an old widow who said her effingers wouldn't stop hurting in the night. She didn't have a husband, she said. He couldn't dig, but she could pay, trade, anything. Just warmth. Elsie looked down at her own daughter, then back at the woman. "You don't need to pay," she said. She taught the old woman to pack sod, showed her where the stones were best, near the creek bank, explained how to tilt the door to stop the wind from howling in. And by spring a second hobbit cabin stood buried in the western slope. The thaw came hard that year. Trees snapped like bones under wet snow. The river swelled to the top of its banks. A few cabins shifted on their foundations. One even collapsed. But the widow's home held. Its roof didn't sag. Its walls didn't split. The ground above it stayed solid, because it wasn't just built in thick. It was part of the dirt, and that meant the storms couldn't pull it down. The newspaper man came in late April. He was from Abilene. He'd heard a story, something about a widow living in a hole who never froze, while the rest of second he begged for firewood. He wore a long coat and a city man's boots, and he tried not to look surprised when she opened the round door with a muddy apron and her hair tied back in a strip of muslin. He asked questions, took notes, asked to take a picture. She said, "No, you're a symbol," he said, "of frontier ingenuity." "No," she replied, "I'm just a mother." He didn't print her name, but the story went out, and more people came. By summer, something new had sprouted in the valley. They called them burrows, dugouts, earth homes, little sod cabins with rock floors, and rounded doors tucked into hillsides. Some used logs, some stone, some adobe, all built into the land like dens instead of on top like thrones. And though folks still put stoves inside, they burned less, slept warmer, lost less to the cold. They built smaller, smarter, closer to the way animals survive. The widow never claimed credit, but when the third winter came, and it was a bad one, and not a single child in that valley Frasido death, there were quiet acknowledgments, nods. At the market, a sack of flour left on her doorstep, a shawl for her daughter. No one said why, but she knew. Then came the preacher. He arrived from out east, boots polished, eyes suspicious, and mouth moving, even when no one asked questions. He called her a blasphemy, said no Christian woman's hold, live like a badger, that the good Lord made houses upright and strong, not buried like a corpse, said it wasn't natural for a woman to live alone, nor right for her to teach others to do the same. She said nothing, just let him shout, but when he left, the ground was still warm under her stones, and the people didn't listen to him. They came back, the next day and the next. And when a schoolteacher from another county brought her class to see the cabin that needed half the wood, they stood with wide eyes and mouths open, asking if the floor really stayed warm without fire. She let them take off their boots and touch the stone. He did. It was in that moment, the stillness of a dozy and children warming their hands on rocks, that Elsie realized something no one had ever taught her, but that she now knew deep in her bones. It wasn't about the cabin. It wasn't even about the winter. It was about being unseen and then seen. About being mocked for building different and then watched closely when everyone else's way failed. It was about survival, not as pride, but as legacy. And her daughter would grow up knowing that. She named her girl Mabel. By the age of 3, Mabel could already help fetch stones. By 4, she asked why other folks didn't just live in hills. If it worked better. Elsie smiled, brushed her cheek, and said, "Because not everyone believes a woman knows best." "But you did," Mabel whispered, and her mother said nothing. Just let the warmth of the stone floor speak for her. By their 4th year, a strange thing happened in the valley. No one called it foolish anymore to build underground. In fact, some barely remembered that they ever had. A few of the old-timers still cleared their throats awkwardly. Went past Elsie at Market Dell. Others nodded with respect, like 2 men would after a hard job done right. The younger folk, those who'd grown up in the shadow of her hill home, had never known the winters before her stone floor and her dug-in stove, simply took it for truth that the smartest way to build was into the earth, not atop it. And fourth, first time since burying her husband in frozen clay, Elsie Vaughan felt something shift in the way people looked at her. She wasn't the widow anymore. She was the one who knew. She never asked for a title, never claimed invention. In fact, she often reminded others that she didn't come up with the idea. She only listened close and built what the land allowed. But those who'd once refused to listen now leaned into her every word. They asked about rock placement, chimney lengths, drainage slopes, wind drift, how to angle windows, how to keep heat in and mice out. Young men who'd once hooted from the town wellner asked how wide a door should be for a hill home to hold heat properly. Some even brought their mothers to meet her, hoping for approval or advice, or just a moment of kindness. She gave it freely, not out of pride, but because she remembered what it felt like to hold a child in your arms. And no, the firewood pile wouldn't last the week, but pride, well, pride crept in quietly. It wasn't on her face, it worsened her hands, the way they moved now, sure, deliberate, unhurried, the way she adjusted the stove vent each morning, not with desperation, but with knowledge. The way she could feel a shift in temperature through her boots before the coals ever dimmed. The way she now stacked her wood into small, tidy pyramids, knowing each piece would be used with purpose, not panic. Cliffs in her voice, too, when she sang to Mabel in the morning when she answered questions from the blacksmith's wife, who came up the ridge every few days, just to ask about a different building trick, a different draft seal, a different floor stone. The pride wasn't loud, but it was steady. Then came the summer storm. The sky boiled over with black clouds, the kind that sit heavy for hours before they burst. Everyone knew it was coming. The cattle grew nervous. The dogs whined. Even the leaves turned upward like they wanted to see the lightning coming before. It struck when the rain came. It was sheets solid, unforgiving. Some cabins perched on slopes fared fine. Others built too low or too loose, flooded. Mud crept under floorboards, foundations cracked. A few families had to climb their lofts with babies on their backs, listening to the slosh of water around their ground floors. But in the buried cabins, silence, dryness, warmth even. Elsie had designed a small trench behind her cabin to catch runoff, just as that engineer from Tennessee once mentioned in passing. It ran along the back like a dry riverbed filled with rocks and broken clay pots, draining water away from the hillside. Her doorway sat half a foot above grade, shielded by a thick overhang of sod and pine slats. Not a drop touched the stone inside. The others who had copied her design in full fared just as well, but those who'd tried to improve it, adding skylights, making tall ceilings, cutting corners by skipping proper drainage, learned their hard way. Mudslides ruined a third of the shallow dug shelters, and folks came crawling back. How did yours stay dry? What did we do wrong? Can you come look? Shaded, not with smugness, but with clarity. She walked through wrecked shelters in her worn boots. Mabel perched on her hip and pointed where the walls should have sloped, where the trench should have been dug, where the seams should have been packed tighter with wet clay before the roof was ever laid. Some listened, others didn't, but all of them knew deep down that she wasn't just a lucky woman with a buried hut. She was something rarer. She was right. That winter, The firewood pile she'd stacked in spring still sat nearly full by January. Her cabin's stone floor never cooled more than a little past dusk. Mabel now helped fetch more twigs, talked to the stones like friends, and knew to press her cheek to the warmest ones after breakfast. They didn't even need to sleep by the stove anymore. The whole home retained heat. The air inside didn't choke or dry their throat. It was still. It was even. It was safe. That winter, Elsie took in 2 orphans whose parents had died crossing a frozen creek on their way back from town. A neighbor brought them up the hill in a wet cart. Their faces pale, their coats thin. Can they stay? Elsie looked at the boys, 10 and 6, eyes wide, lips purple. Nick can stay. Shell at them, near the hearth, pulled blankets over them, and showed them gently where the stones were warmest. The next morning, they were smiling. That winter she stopped being alone. She didn't remarry, but she wasn't alone. A handful of children came each morning from the nearby dugouts, babysat while their mothers hauled firewood or sewed boots, or nursed the sick. Elsie fed them simple things: fried dough, beans, stewed apple skins. She taught Mabel. Her letters taught the others to patch tears, to sweep ash properly, to test a rock's warmth with the back of a wrist. It was a schoolhouse, though no one called it that. And when one of the new mothers asked if she could help build her own buried room to teach her boys in, Elsie didn't hesitate. She brought her shovel. There was one man, though, who still refused. Caleb Dowser built this biggest cabin in the valley, high on stilts. Wide porch, 3 chimneys, imported lumber from Dallas, called the dug-in homes rat dens. Sedgar meant mentor, rise above the dirt, not crawl inside it like worms. He had 5 sons, all off them loud, all of them sick that winter. By February, 2 had frostbite. The youngest was coughing blood. His wife came to Elsie in secret, asking for advice. Not help, just advice. Elsie told her how to insulate the walls, how to use blankets and stone jars heaved by the fire, how to block the wind from under the house with packed snow. The wife thanked her, cried a little, went home. 2 nights later, Dowser stormed up the hill. You've been telling my wife how to ruin our home. Elsie opened her door, stared at him through the falling snow, didn't answer. I don't need your kind of house, he spat. I don't need your stones. He didn't argue. She simply stepped back and pointed at the warmth behind her, where Mabel was giggling with the other children, their faces pink with heat. Dowser turned and walked away. 3 weeks later, his youngest son died, and 2 months after that, Dowser tore down his back wall and started digging. Elsie didn't smile when she saw the trench. She just nodded and went back inside, because that's the way of things in the frontier. Some men only learn from loss, but if they learn, that's still a step toward better. By the 5th year, buried cabins outnumbered the log ones. People still built log homes, but now they dug first. Buried floors, stone bases, curved ceilings. Some added root cellars or second chambers. Some carved little rooms into clay with candle nooks and stone beds. The school teacher built one. So did the doctor's assistant, the blacksmith's wife. They called them hill homes now, and they all started with a foundation of rock, just like Elsie's. The Abilene newspaper returned, this time with a camera. She agreed. They took a picture of her and Mabel at the round door, the chimney puffing. Behind them, the grass roof catching the last gold light of fall. Mabel barefoot on Thewham stones, smiling wide. The caption read, "The warmest cabin in the territory. How a widow changed the way the West survives winter." They never mentioned firewood, but everyone who read it knew. By the 6th winter, there were no longer jokes about hobbit holes, not even from newcomers. The men who once mocked had long since either copied his widow's design or quietly moved on. Their pride left behind like an old coat worn to patch. What had once looked laughable now stood as proof of survival. The buried cabins had outlasted 5 brutal winters, 2 spring floods, a windstorm that tore the steeple clean off the chapel roof, and Downey's summer drought that cracked the valley's outer edge. Yet Elsie's dug-in home remained steady, quiet, half invisible, and warmer than ever. She hadn't changed it much. No expansions, no added rooms. She didn't need more. Mabel was growing fast, now 5, talkative with her father's eyebrows and her mother's sharp, patient eyes. But space was enough. The stones held heat, the earth kept the cold away, the chimney never once froze, and now she wasn't the only one teaching. There was a boy, Jory, who came up the hill each week with a question, written on a strip of cloth. He couldn't write on paper, couldn't afford it, but he tied his scraps to sticks and left them outside her door. Each message had one question. How thick does a sod roof need to be to hold snow? What kind of clay works best for sealing door frames? Can you build 2 rooms instead of 1? Or does the heat not travel? She always answered Dot, sometimes with a spoken word when she saw him running up the slope. Other times by carving a reply into the stick itself with a small blade and setting it back on the fence post. Jory became one of the best builders in the valley by the age of 15. His first solo dugout, a double-chambered winter hut with a half-moon vent system and angled stone hearth, stayed 44 degrees warmer than any traditional log cabin that year. No one called him foolish either. The blacksmith's wife, Marjorie, who'd once spent nights crying from frostbitten toes in her loft bedroom, had built her second cabin almost entirely underground by year 7. Her eldest son helped her dig it, shoulders still bruised from hauling tools. But when they laid the stone floor, curved the entrance, and stacked turf overhead with moss and dry weeds, it turned into something else entirely. Feels like a womb, she said to Elsie, the first time she stood inside it. Warm like before the world ever happened. Elsie only nodded. She knew that warmth, that shelter. It wasn't about walls or ceilings. It was about knowing nothing outside could touch you. It was the winter of the rat plague that proved everything. The rodents came after the harvest failed in a neighboring valley. Drawn to grain, to smoke, 2 homes filled with the promise of warmth and food. They crept under floorboards, nested in lofts, bit through boots and wool, and sleeping children's toes. One cabin lost 3 newborn goats in the same week, nor apart in the dark. But not one of the breed homes was breached, not one. The rats couldn't find a way in. Too tight, too packed, too clever. The round door had no gaps, the stone floors too smooth. The flues were blocked at night, sealed with clay stoppers, and unleak above-ground cabins that sat like islands. In a frozen floodplain, the hill homes were part of the landscape. The rats passed them over like stones in the field. After that, even the most stubborn settlers gave up the fight. Every new home built in the region, every single one, was either dug into a slope or laid half below grade. And if every builder, no matter how proud, no matter how quiet, asked to see the widow's cabin first. She never said no, but she never let more than one person inside at a time. It wasn't vanity, it was reverence. You didn't crowd a church, and to her, the home she'd carved from earth and grief was sacred. That spring, Mabel helped lay the for the new schoolhouse built entirely into the southern face of the ridge. It had taken 3 years of saving, hauling, and stone collecting from half the families in the valley, but they had done it. They'd followed Elsie's layout, round roof, curved clay walls, a floor of packed stone, sealed with lard and dashed paste, banked by thick sod, and braced with beams pulled from storm-felled trees. On the morning of its opening, 23 children stepped barefoot onto the stone floor and smiled. Not one shivered. No Tony asked for a fire, and Mabel, standing beside her mother in the corner, whispered, "It feels just like home." Elsie touched her shoulder. It is that summer. Strangers started arriving. Not traders, not preachers, families. Families, from drought-track counties further west. Men whose wives were sick, women whose husbands had frozen trying to split wood through the night, children with coughs, sores, blue fingers, empty bellies. They came with wagons half broken and boots tied with string and wordless weary looks that said, "Please, please tell us how to survive." The valley didn't turn them away. It couldn't. Not after what they'd learned. Not after what one widow had shown them. They shared what they could. Tools, scraps, rope, hay, and most of all, knowledge. How to dig, where to brace, when to seal, what stones held heat the longest, where topless your hearth for the best draft, how to slope the door against wind, how to plant moss early so your roof would grow thick before the cold set in. It spread like gospel, a new kind of frontier wisdom, not about taming Thieland, but listening to it, not rising above nature, but entering it, trusting it, becoming part of it. Elsie never preached, she just kept building. By her 10th winter, there were over 40 hill homes in the region, some deeper than others, some grander, some with 2 levels, some with small stables built halfway into the dirt beside them. But no one lasted longer. None were warmer on half the firewood, and none, not a single one, had ever let in the freeze. Because there was something else in her home besides clay and stone. There was intent. She had built it not to be seen, not to prove anything. She had built it to survive, and in doing so, had shown an entire region how to live. That winter, Mabel fell ill. Not from cold, from a fever brought in by a traveling boy who'd slept in the schoolhouse. Elsie kept her home hot, laid her daughter on the stones, held her tight, whispered every story she could remember, used every herb, every compress, every prayer. 3 days passed, the fever broke, and when Mabel opened her eyes, the first thing she said was, "Did the fire go out?" Elsie laughed. Then, really laughed. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing her cheek to the stone beside her. "It never goes out the winter after Mabel's recovery passed with little drama, no deep freezes, no floods, no tragedies. Instead, it was remembered as the warm winter, not for the weather, but for what people had built. The entire valley, once scattered with drafty wooden homes perched high and proud on the exposed flats, had transformed. The hills were now dotted with what looked like small grassy blisters, half-hidden doors tucked into slopes, smoke curling gently from chimneys that rose up like thorn stubs from the ground. Newcomers often missed them at first glance, but locals knew better. The warmth of Avonlea was no longer measured by firewood stacks or chimney height. It was measured by how well you had listened to the land and how low your door sat beneath the wind. Elsie Vaughan had no title, no church plaque, no page in any county ledger. She never held office, never led a meeting, never called herself a leader. But she was quietly in the same way stone holds warmth hours after the fire has died. You didn't notice it at first, but the longer you stayed near it, the more it kept you alive. In the 12th year, a family from the northern mountains arrived. 4 children, 1 missing a hand, the father with a crooked spine from a logging accident, and a mother who hadn't spoken since the river swallowed their cabin in spring. They had nothing but 1 broken mule and a makeshift sled piled high with sacks that smelled of damp and mildew. They didn't ask for charity. They just wanted to know how the widow had built her hearth. They'd heard stories, not from any newspaper, not from some grand traveling man, just from another family who'd come through once, who had seen the round door in the hillside, the smoke that never stopped, the baby with cheeks rosy in February. "Please," the father said, voice soft, eyes lower than his shoulders. "Tell me how you made it warm." Elsie looked at Mabel, now 12, standing straight, already near her mother's height, and nodded once. Mabel stepped forward. "I'll show them," and she did. That was how it began. The next generation. Mabel became a builder in her own right. She had grown up knowing warmth, not as a luxury, but as a birthright. She could test the grade Ophir slope by the tilt of a loose stone. She knew which masses packed tighter, which soil drained better, how many hers it took for a clay seam to cure before rain. She carried more in her head at age 14 than most grown men did after a decade of building. She built 3 homes that spring, 2 for widows, 1 for an old man with shaking hands, who could no longer strike an axe, and then she built her own. It was small, only 1 room, but low, round, tight acer drum, and warm as bread in a cloth. She heated it once, and the stone floor stayed hot for 3 days. Elsie stood in its doorway that first night, watching her daughter light the kindling in the hearth she'd shaped herself, and felt something old and frozen finally melt inside her chest. This wasn't just survival anymore, it was a legacy. By year 15, outside counties began to take notice, not of her necessarily, but of what had happened in the valley. Winter death tolls had dropped, coughs were fewer, even animals fared better. And all the while, firewood usage had declined by nearly half. One state official came to investigate, a quiet man with a little notebook and a scarf pulled too tight. He stayed for 4 days, ate in 3 homes, slept in a dugout wrapped in wool and stove warmth. By that time he left. He'd stopped asking why and started asking, how soon can we teach? This, elsewhere. He published a paper. It made no mention of Elsie Vaughan by name, but it spoke of a quiet revolution in winter efficiency, sparked to be an anonymous woman's cabin design that fused practicality with the physics of heat retention. Elsie never saw Thepapa, never needed. 2. The land had already given her all the recognition she would ever need. And then the fire dotted came not from her home, but from the field to ridges east. where dry wind caught the edge of a blacksmith's disc coal bucket and licked its way up the hill like a starving dog. The dry summer had turned the grass to tinder. Capons above ground caught fast. 3 families fled downhill, flames chasing them across their own roofs. One child was lost in the smoke before the wind shifted. A boy named Eli Mayball had taught him how to patch clay, seems 2 winters earlier. They buried him with soot still on his face. After that, the valley began sealing every new home with fire mud. Chimneys were shortened, vents braced. Ivory fireproofing technique Elsie had once used instinctively, like laying damp moss behind her hearth, or stacking stone between flue and beam, was now carved into every building guide for 100 miles. And when one settler from over the mountain asked who had invented it all, someone only said, "The widow Upthridge." They didn't need to say more. In the 20th winter, Mabel had a daughter. Elsie held her in the stone-warm dark, the same way she had held Mabel in the earliest, loneliest days. The baby was born in the same room, same stones, same stove, same carved chimney that had once been doubted, laughed at, dismissed as a gopher hole. And now it was legend. No one remembered the jokes, they only remembered the warmth. Sometimes, travelers came hoping to see the place themselves. They'd heard stories of a widow who'd buried herself to survive, of a floor that heated like iron with half the fire, of a girl who'd built homes like nests in clay. Most of them expected something bigger, grand. What they found was a door in the earth, small, plain, no sign, no marker, and beside it, a stone bench. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they found a grey-haired woman sitting on it, quiet, sewing a bit of wool, or watching her granddaughter chase birds across the ridge. They'd ask, "Are you her?" And she'd look up, smile, maybe, sometimes nod, sometimes not, but always before they left, she'd say the same thing.